purpose of the paper I'm working on is to ask, when are non-territorial autonomy arrangements a morally appropriate or permissible or warranted? I'm still not certain about the language here, but I'd like to say appropriate more than anything else. Response by states to various minority claims, given possible alternatives. And this last part of the sentence is quite important for me, because I'm initially not at all an NTA expert. I've done most of my work in moral theories of war and secession. And I think there can be some interesting combinations and contributions to be made from that side. As such, it's not so much about the relationship between minorities and majorities, but rather, for me, minorities and the state. When theorizing about possible normative frameworks for NTA arrangements, we usually speak of legal or constitutional arrangements, but these frameworks can also be developed, as we've obviously heard in the first lecture, from an ethical and philosophical point of view. Domestic legal histories and international law are full of such historical examples, since ancient, medieval, and early modern age jurists were philosophers at least as often as they were anything else. Therefore, when mentioning a normative framework, my paper will focus largely on moral philosophy. The goal of Entan and the cost action from which it stems, as I take it, is to discuss possibilities and make academic breakthroughs in the field of NTA as an alternative to separatist movements and tendencies, which can result in more extreme or robust expressions of minority self-determination, such as various regional formats for territorial autonomy or even secession. This is, I think, clearly stated even in the founding documents for this network. So, when one theorizes about NTA, there remains, I think, an intellectual obligation to place them in a larger framework of options or alternatives, from a complete lack of state to minority and minority to state arrangements to the other extreme secession. Because of this, one's broader normative framework for NTA doesn't have to present a simple binary option, either NTA or separatism, but rather, I think, needs to place them in a spectrum of possible alternatives for the relationship between the state and its minority or its minorities. Now, the possible alternatives, as I see them so far within this relationship, and the ones being explored in my paper, when it comes to minority rights claims, seem to be the strongest, the most extreme one is secession, or a kind of counterpart revolution. In one case, we have a minority seceding from a state and taking a part of its territory. In another, we would have it taking over completely. The second is territorial autonomy arrangements, but within a given state. The third is NTA, and it's the middle ground, actually. The fourth would be minority arrangements with the states that are less than NTA. And a fifth option would be a lack of any arrangement. Now, what I want to see is not only when NTA is appropriate, but when any of the options is appropriate. And then we can set NTA within a moral framework. I'm not sure about legal, and I'm not even sure about political here. The two main questions are then, what are the criteria of moral appropriateness? This is a sort of, I think, methodological question for this paper. And the second, when is any of the alternatives morally appropriate? This should produce ultimately a kind of typology based on the methodological criteria I mentioned. Now, methodologically speaking, it makes sense to start from the most difficult of the alternatives to justify, and I think that's secession, because it represents the most extreme possible claim of a minority towards a state, or in some unilateral cases, even against a state. Once such a criterion or set of criteria is established, the criteria for other alternatives can be reasonably lowered, and the criteria for secession will be indicative of what these lower criteria could perhaps be. For each of the alternatives, the paper should establish a paradigmatic case. I haven't resolved my paradigmatic cases yet. This is why it's not quite done yet. Which can be historical, but can also be the result of a thought experiment or the result of both, allowing for a casuistic approach as well. Within this spectrum, the most important first choice is that of an appropriate theory of a moral right to secession. This is because some of these more normative theories maintain that it is a primary moral right of certain groups to make a strong self-determining claim to secede from their existing states and create new ones, thus taking away territory from the former. As we know anyway, and as I think we heard quite clearly in today's keynote lecture, there is not enough space for everyone to do this, so it's not really it's not really an option. So what I'd like to do is start and really just explain what I think is the proper choice of a theory of secession, and which one can actually be in line with the concept of NTA, and can actually function for NTA purposes. There are two types, as you certainly may know. There are primary rights theories, and I will not be for these types of theories, and there are remedial rights only theories. Primary rights theories are divided into what are called ascriptivist because of ascribed properties and characteristics, or rather nationalist theories. And the other kind are plebiscitary theories. Nationalist theories claim that certain types of groups, because of their common cultural features, meaning either national minorities, or you can define them as ethnic minorities, sometimes religious minorities, have a primary moral right to protect their culture, language, etc., by seceding. Not just in any other way, but by seceding from their existing states. Most authors, example Miller, do offer relatively strict conditions under which this can occur, but nevertheless maintain that the right to secede is a primary one, meaning that it doesn't have much to do with the treatment of a minority is receiving by a state, in terms of the existence of well-developed NTA arrangements or lack thereof. They can have great NTA, they can exercise their freedoms, cultural rights, and still choose to secede, and no one should be able to stop them. And of course, certain authors think that this should be a part of international law as well. Plebiscitary theories go further, as their proponents, such as, let's say, Christopher Wellborn and Harry Barron, believe that secession from a liberal democratic state is a matter of plebiscite and not even connected to groups such as ethnic or national groups. Any group of people, if they represent a majority in a part of the state's territory, have the primary moral right to secede if they choose to do so. And it can be a liberal country, which is a state, a liberal democratic state, which vouches for everyone's rights, and everyone can actually exercise their rights. And they still believe that this has to be possible. The only real condition is they cannot create another state which is less liberal from the one from which they are seceding. So they see it, the point is, as a primary right. I think neither of these two theories seem appropriate as a starting point for a framework within which NTA could play a significant theoretical and practical role. With nationalist theories as a theoretical starting point, NTA would be more of a milestone in a minority group's a kind of cursus honorum, a building block for future growth towards stronger separatist claims, and this is not the goal from an NTA perspective. With plebiscitary theories, there's even no relevant connection, since groups which could not identify certain common traits in the way that national minorities do, would never consider, need, or be able to make use of NTA. The second group of theories of the moral right to secession is not as a primary right, and claims it can only be a remedial right. They call them remedial rights only theories. Remedialists, most notably I'd say Alan Buchanan, claim that a moral right to secede, which also includes a territorial claim against an existing state, can be established only for minority groups who find that they have no recourse in protecting themselves and their rights other than secession. And that's the only option for them, because of obvious oppression or elements such as that. Because of the rights of the state, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, but also because of international stability and peace, remedialists prefer various forms of self-determination less than full statehood, even if it's territorial autonomy within a region of an already existing state, and believe that the international legal system should encourage alternatives to secession. To cite Buchanan's condition, a minority has the moral right to unilaterally secede only in cases of, and it's three conditions. One is large-scale and persistent violations of basic human rights. The second is unjust taking of the territory of a legitimate state, where secession is simply the taking back of wrongly taken territory. And in certain cases, the state's persisting violation of agreements to accord a minority group's limited self-government within the state, and the breaking of existing contracts that would have to vouch for that. He also says a more austere approach would recognize only the first one, only persistent and large-scale violations of basic human rights. I believe that this is the theory to which NTA, or some kind of concept of NTA, could be largely connected. The rest of the criteria for the other options are, as I said, reasonably lower. If we look at criteria for the moral appropriateness for territorial arrangements within a state, they're morally appropriate when secession is not warranted because there is not such large-scale oppression. And where it's not obvious that it would continue in any case. The criteria for the moral appropriateness of NTA would be when territorial autonomy is not warranted, not needed in any case. And these are significantly lower. So it's what I'm trying to say, that it's from a moral perspective, I believe that it's much easier to justify the NTA option than it is to justify a territorial option or a fully separatist option. That's the claim I'm trying to make. But to make it, I have to speak from the perspective of remedial rights-only theories of secession. I believe if we take any other approach, any reasonable claim to NTA explodes. Thank you.
In your theory of secession, you make these 5 points, and it's a hierarchy. And we are all socialized with this hierarchy. And me too. So it's clear, so secession is the best and doing nothing is the worst. But who says that NTA is less worthy than territorial autonomy?
Thank you very much for that question. It allows me to clarify some things. So, not a hierarchy at all, and I didn't envision it that way. In fact, I don't favor secession over non-territorial autonomy arrangements, but the opposite. I favor NTA over secession. The reason I spend most of my time speaking about these theories of secession is because I believe that if we are to justify either the concept of NTA or a specific arrangement from a moral perspective, that we have this intellectual obligation to hold some kind of theory of secession. And of the available options, I think only one is acceptable for an NTA scholar, and that's the one I wanted to present. So it's certainly not a hierarchy. I went from 1 to 5, but in a horizontal line rather than a vertical one or anything else. But I'll make sure to make that clear in the paper, so thanks.
For me, it was clear that it's horizontal. I also very much like the fact that you helped me as a relative newcomer to the discussion of non-territorial autonomy. You really helped me to understand also what is it that I find it a little bit unclear and problematic in the discussion. Because when one uses the label or the signifier non-territorial, it triggers connotation of dichotomy, okay? Territorial and non-territorial. And also, I don't think it's very productive in general to engage in a positive project while using a non-label. So it's like, for example, if you go to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, they define the indigenous Palestinian Arabs in the territory as non-Jewish community. And also, blacks are not non-white, they are blacks. You know? So it's, what I'm trying to say, it's good to say, so why did you have, because you gave the range. What I was missing before also, I mean, flying also, I like the fact that there is you did a spectrum from secession to nothing, and in between, but the two extremes, in my view, are less interesting. What I'm trying to understand here, because I don't like this non-territorial dichotomy, I like to understand what do you think is the difference between territorial autonomy that is sub-state, because here also the assumption is that territorial autonomy is supposed to be self-determination in a state. So as for some place like Wales, okay, or Scotland, not a state, but then there is a territorial dimension to Wales. You understand? Exactly. So that's why it's what it is. Wales is not a non-territorial autonomy; it's a sub-state territorial autonomy. So what's the difference between a sub-state territorial autonomy and NTA? Oh. That's the key. Where we live the extreme, we live the secession, and I think you yourself shouldn't even waste too much time on secession because that's the fallback. You understand? People don't need to. This is Wilson, you know. So in a way, it's better if you explain more the middle terms. You understand?
I'm not sure if you asked me about practical differences between this, but the most obvious ones are with territorial autonomies. Like in cases of Scotland, one can have ministries, parliaments, so on and so forth, but does not have the opportunity to create one's own foreign policy. That's the only difference from being a state, really. So I think it's still a pretty good position. Of course, one would have to take into account a certain problem stated in the keynote lecture today, which is lack of representation internationally then, for some. That would still keep being a problem, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you have resolved some of my question about the hierarchy, because I also understood it as hierarchy, but I'm happy. And I think it's important to make clear that in the examples you mentioned, these are all different claims.
Yes.
And therefore they cannot really be on a sort of on a line, whether it goes horizontally or vertically. They are very different claims. So you would never have a group that is seeking territorial autonomy, maybe even secession, would never go and be happy with non-territorial autonomy. I mean, it's simply not feasible. I think this is important to keep separate. So I also question a little bit why you are spending time on discussing secession, because physically, how would secession happen for a non-territorially defined group?
It wouldn't.
Well, it's physically not possible.
Yes.
So maybe it's more a footnote discussion. That's what I'm trying to say.
If we imagine a country, a state, within which a national minority is the majority in one part of the territory, that minority then there faces certain options. And I asked, which of those are most morally feasible? And that's why I think that entertaining the various options is important. And if out of that discussion we can say that NTA is the most morally feasible, which I believe we can, then that's the direction I want to take it.